Jobs and Economic Development Committee to order. We have some work to do today, but before then, Representative Haley, would you move the minutes?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Haley. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor of moving the minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. So we're done. Let's see. What's up first? Huh. Well, you know, Representative Noor is up first, but we could really torture people with all that, you know, those treats that the freshman has brought.
All right.
Go ahead. Why don't you go up to the witness table? And,
Well, we.
Sure. Why don't we have the page pass the treats around, and everybody take as many as possible for those who did not come. We'll just eat them all. Oh. Oh, napkins, good. Wait a second. I took too many. There you go. Representative Noor, I'm going to do you a favor and tell you that I'll move your bill. Not because you can't, but because we're in a new kind of era where we have to kind of refer it to, I'll read it and then go over it. I'm going to move your bill and move House File 282 as is referred to the Ways and Means Committee with a recommendation that it be re-referred to Housing Finance and Policy Division. So just so people understand, if your bill is going beyond, it's going beyond Ways and Means, you should make a recommendation to which committee it goes to. You can't say that it goes to, but with a recommendation that it go. That's something that we haven't done before, but it gives us as much as we can control Representative Carlson and the Ways and Means Committee, this is about as much as we can do. So, having said all that, Representative Noor, would you like to present your bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. As the sambusas are going around, it's spicy, it's beef, it's one of our delicacy in the community. So I hope you enjoy it, and you may need some water. So just in case.
and there's a spot that one of your friends took me to over there. I'll never be able to find it again. But oh my God, these were great. I hope you bought them from the same place.
It came from the same place.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have House File 282. This bill is from the 2018. It was passed by the House and the Senate, but it was included in the Omnibus Prime bill that failed, as we all know about it. So this was a non-controversial bill. It includes, it modifies some provisions related to manufactured and modular homes. Members, Mr. Chair, this bill decreases the licensing fee for manufactured homes, which is from $300 to $180. This is in line with the recommendation from Department of Labor and Industry. And it also defines what modular home is, because there wasn't any definition in the statute. It also creates a way to increase the fund that is reserved for the manufactured homes from $1 million to $3 million. And this uses the fee that is paid by the manufactured homes. It also creates an opportunity for the MMB to collect the resources or provide at least $400,000 if and when that resource is depleted. This is This was created mainly because recently, with so many parks being vacated and making sure that individuals are relocated to a different place, so they required a payment from that fund. So just in case the revenue goes down, we are requesting that in this bill to MMB or Housing Finance to provide $400,000. And basically, this bill resurrects what was agreed upon by all the stakeholders. And I have Mark Brunner from Modular Manufactured Homes Association who can help us and guide us with some of the negotiations that were done in the previous bill.
Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark Bruner, Manufactured Modular Home Association of Minnesota. Thank you, Representative, for authoring this bill and advancing the provisions that were adopted last year through a long process. Some of these were actually individual bills that then got merged together. Our association represents the builders, our manufacturers of manufactured modular homes. Totally, there are about 15 plants in the state building either manufactured or modular homes. We also represent manufactured home park community owners. There are about 1,000 licensed manufactured home parks in the state. They're with about 50,000 home sites. Manufactured homes are the state's largest source of non-subsidized affordable housing. And essentially the impetus for the bill, aside from the fee reductions, the fee reduction for manufactured home installers, which as explained was sort of a follow-through for the Department of Labor and Industry 2 years ago, reducing overall contractor fees because their permit revenue was up, and it was just discovered that there were 2 provisions in statute that needed to be resolved relating to installers. That got taken care of last year. The provision that deals with modular homes in communities updates a 1950 statute that simply says you can only put a manufactured home in a manufactured home community. There were no modular homes then, and today there are, smaller modular homes, and as a way to try to preserve manufactured home parks and allow smaller homes to be included with unique designs that are modular. By definition, the change would allow that, and then it finally makes some changes to the relocation trust fund by raising the cap, as well as adding some reporting requirements and how the invoicing is done by MMB and getting them accurate lists and information on who they should be invoicing if the fund were to drop below $3 million. We worked last session with the League of Minnesota Cities on the modular provision, Department of Labor and Industry, the All Parks Alliance for Change, and I've talked to Department of Labor and Industry and the All Parks Alliance for Change the past couple days. They've suggested a couple of things they'd like to see perhaps changed moving forward. So we've agreed to work with them on some possible tweaks to the language as presented as things move forward in this body and in the Senate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do you have any additional comments, Representative Noor, before I open it up for questions?
Mr. Chair, as Mark Brunner has already indicated, there are a few minor changes that were recommended by other stakeholders, such as the land title and other groups. We're working with them, and we hope to address those in when it's referred to the Housing Division.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Representative Koznick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Noor, thank you for bringing this bill back from previous years, and I think it's a good bill that reduces regulation, bureaucracy, and licensing fees. So I appreciate that part of the bill. But more importantly, it promotes an important source for affordable housing that's obviously needed. So hope to see this bill continue on.
Thank you, Representative Koznick. I don't think there was a question there, was there?
No, just a voice of support.
I am told it's good to have staff that whispers in your ear. There's another testifier that wanted to say a few words. Mr. Anderson. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Dave Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of All Parks Alliance for Change. It's a statewide association of manufactured homeowners, and we're very grateful to the representative for bringing the language back after the veto at the end of the session. Specifically, I wanted to talk about the Manufactured Home Relocation Trust Fund. It's a program that the state legislature authorized the establishment of in 2007. If people aren't familiar with it, it provides both relocation funds to move homes as well as funds to replace homes if they're not capable of being moved. In addition to an annual $15 fee for every homeowner occupied lot, there's also a contribution that the park owners make at time of closure, a flat one-time fee per single and a double-wide home. And obviously the reason to make changes to the Relocation Trust Fund are to ensure its financial sustainability. In 2011, there was a cap placed on the fund that limited the amount that the balance could grow to $1 million. Unfortunately, in 2017, $995,000 plus in relocation benefits were paid out, so it became clear to everyone that $1 million was unfortunately too low of an amount. So I'm very grateful that the proposal is coming back to increase the amount that the balance can grow to $3 million. Again, it's an entirely privately financed program, contributions from the homeowners, contributions from the park owners, and the role of the state is just in facilitating the collection and disbursement of funds. And even that is handled through local government, that Minnesota Housing oversees the program, but administration of it is delegated to local government to be responsible for. So it's a fairly small but important role that the state plays. We're very grateful for the increase in the fund balance. As was mentioned, there are a couple of concerns that we have. We are committed to working with the Park Owner Association to resolve those in time for the next hearing in the Housing Committee. Just to mention briefly, one of them has to do with the increase in the amount of the demolition credit. The other has to do with some of the proposed changes in how the $15 per year fee is invoiced. But we had a very good discussion about making those changes, and we're very optimistic about getting all of that resolved in time for the next hearing before the Housing Committee. Thank you very much.
Members, are there any questions for either the witnesses or the author? Any questions? Seeing none, I have one. I'm looking at the Cliff Notes version of the bill. When a statutory notice period, only if the entity agrees in writing to continue the park operations for at least 6 years. Well, if I'd read it all, I probably would have gotten the answer to that. So I just want to make sure I understand, and Representative Noor, that if someone goes in and purchases the park, those that are in the park, residents, understand that at least 6 years they have to start thinking about maybe moving, because too many of these parks are closing down and being turned into industrial parks or single family. It's 6 years at least, and that would be section 6.
Mr. Chair, I will refer that question to Mark Bruner to provide more detail.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mark Bruner. Yeah, the intent of this provision is to ensure that if someone acquires a manufactured home park that is otherwise going to close, that they will at least acknowledge that they're going to continue to keep it in operation for that period of time so that it doesn't close in another 2 years, that kind of thing. So there's just some long-term intent involved for somebody acquiring from someone that's otherwise going to close it.
Mr. Bruner, does the park owner, the new park owner have to notify residents that move in after that 6-year signatory piece is put together so that they don't move in there the fifth, like year 5 or year 4 and realize, oh, I just spent $10,000 to move my house here. Now I got to do it all over again?
Mr. Chairman, actually, that notice provision that you're suggesting is not here, but would perhaps be a good addition.
I'll let that go into the housing committee.
Okay.
Something to bring up and think about. Seeing no other questions. Seeing no other questions, unless you have any final words, Representative Noor?
No, I just wanted to thank the members, and I hope the bill moves to the Housing Finance Division.
Thank you, Representative Noor. I want any other freshman that's bringing a bill forward for the first time to this committee to realize that he has set a very high bar. and you better not mess up. So I will renew my motion to move House File 282 as referred to the Ways and Means Committee with the recommendation that it be re-referred to the Housing Finance and Policy Division. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed? You're on your way.
Thank you so much.
Members, today we have a presentation by the state demographer on workforce and labor information. Dr. Susan Brower. And welcome to the committee, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in today. And oh, there you go.
Very good.
Please identify yourself for the tape and proceed.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, representatives, my name is Susan Brower. I'm the state demographer and I work in the Department of Administration. I've been asked to share with you today some of the big demographic changes that are shaping our workforce in particular and shaping the jobs picture in the state. There are some massive changes that are happening right now and that are projected to continue into the next 10 to 15 years. And so I will focus on what those changes are and what they mean in terms of the employment picture for Minnesotans into the next 15 to 20 years. But first, I just want to share a general sense of how our state is growing because it impacts our economic growth. It impacts the availability of workers. So just to kind of ground us in the overall picture of how Minnesota grows relative to the U.S. and relative to other states, we do relatively well in terms of growth for a Midwestern state, for a Northeastern state. Our growth rate in the last 8 years has been about, on average, very similar to the U.S. average. We've grown in Minnesota about 6%, which is just under 6%, which is the national average. Excuse me. You can see if you compare Minnesota to other Midwestern states that the growth is considerably higher. Together, those Midwestern states and Northeastern states are sometimes called the Frost Belt. And so you can see in comparison to our Frost Belt neighbors, we do fairly well. There are many states in the south and the southwest of the U.S. that are growing much faster than we are here in Minnesota. Within the state, the growth that is happening is really concentrated in the metropolitan areas. That's been the case for some time, but it's really picked up in the last 8 to 10 years. We've seen this concentrated growth right in the metropolitan areas, and even more so right in the middle of the metropolitan areas in the center cities. Most of the growth in the state that it has occurred in the last 8 years has been within the 7-county Twin Cities metropolitan area. You can see here that Minnesota grew by about 275,000 people in these 7 years shown here. And within that growth, about 135 additional people were added to Hennepin and Ramsey County. So much of that growth is again, concentrated in the metropolitan areas and in the Twin Cities. You can see from this map, the very darkest areas in blue are showing you where the highest growth areas are in terms of numbers. And so you can also see that there are blue counties across the state, counties that are growing. Usually, if you see a darker blue, it's because there's a metropolitan area there. You can see the Fargo-Moorhead area show up there on the western edge of the state. You can see the Rochester area, Olmsted County show up in the southern part of the state. And then the corridor along I-94 up toward the St. Cloud area. It's not unusual compared to the rest of the U.S. to see metropolitan growth. It really has picked up in the last 10 or so years to see a lot of urban metropolitan growth. What's happening in other metropolitan areas across the U.S. is that growth is starting to dissipate out from the center cities. We haven't seen that yet here in Minnesota, but we would expect that that would be the case in the coming years.
Dr. Brown,
Mr. Chair.
when you say dissipate out from the metro areas, are you talking a general geographic distance, a distance, or are you talking it's just a dense, the suburbs becoming more dense, or can you explain that a little bit more?
Mr. Chair, yes, both of those things. So we've seen a tremendous amount of growth in Minneapolis and St. Paul, for example. The same is true of other metropolitan areas, but the growth has really been concentrated in those center cities. And what's happened in other areas, other metropolitan areas across the U.S. is that growth has begun to pick up in the suburbs outside of those central cities. That means more density for those first-ring suburbs. And typically what's happening is that the young generation that moved to those downtown areas are transitioning further in their life course to owning their own households. They're purchasing homes, and they're purchasing them further out in those metropolitan areas.
But that's not my question. I don't want to say this question. So Hutchinson is, 50 miles outside from the core city. Is that seeing more growth? Are they moving out? Can we expect to see it go quite that far out, like Hutchinson and Faribault or Northfield, Waseca, those kind of that kind of growth?
Mr. Chair, that type of growth is typically tied to the economic growth of those particular cities. And so it's not as much tied to kind of this phenomenon that I'm talking about, urbanization and kind of metropolitanization of the state. We are seeing strong growth in many cities across the state right now, in addition to the metropolitan areas. You can see them here, but for now, most of those growth areas are first and second ring suburbs of these metropolitan areas or the center city. Yeah, so it's not that this growth is exclusive, it's just kind of the characterizing, or it characterizes the trend right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So just for some point of reference, between the last two censuses, 2000 and 2010, Minneapolis and St. Paul both lost population, Minneapolis just barely. So those populations have been very, very flat for some time. in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and you can see since 2010 that there's been an estimated 40,000 people added to Minneapolis and 24,000 added to St. Paul. And so it just illustrates that this is a turnaround in the pattern that we have been seeing for some time, where growth has been shifting outward. Now we're seeing it more concentrated in the center. And this, of course, has implications for, where the workers are located, where the consumers are located, and for economic growth overall. Excuse me. So I want to talk a little bit about aging, because aging is the trend that is really driving the picture of the workforce right now, one of the pictures of the workforce right now. In particular, the availability of workers is being driven by population aging in the state. So to give you a sense of what the aging trend in Minnesota has looked like historically for the last 6 decades, we have added to the state anywhere between about 47,000 and 91,000 additional older adults each decade. That group was growing because the state was growing. This decade and next will add closer to about 300,000 older adults. So we're going from about 680,000 older adults in 2010 to about 1.3 million in 2030. This transition is happening in a relatively concentrated period of time, these 2 decades. Of course, we're almost through that first bar there, and we anticipate that we'll add about 300,000 older adults to the state over the next 10 years. One of the reasons I was drawn to demographics to begin with was that it provides a really simple solution to look into the future. And so I just want to point to the fact that the numbers that I have for aging are pretty easy to predict. We can look at how many people are here right now. We can age them forward in time, and that's what we do. We account for migration. We account for mortality. And that's how we come up with our projections. But I can say that projecting the age forward, the age distribution of our state forward in time is a really pretty simple process that is fairly accurate, is very accurate going forward. And so what I'm sharing with you today is really what I believe will play out. There are very few things that would change this picture. So what does it mean to have a state that is rapidly aging, to have a huge population of baby boomers who are moving past the age of 65? The first transition that we're feeling now and that we will continue to feel for the next 10 years is that the baby boomers are moving out of the workforce. They're retiring. That began when the first baby boomer hit that age sometime around 2011. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. And so 2011 was when the first baby boomer turned 65. It's a big generation spanning 20 or so years. The last baby boomer will not turn 65 until 2029. And so we're kind of right in the middle of this transition, right in the middle of this great movement out of the workforce. We're beginning to feel it now. Employers are beginning to feel what that means now. And those pressures will continue to build over the next 15 or so years as the younger baby boomers continue to move into retirement. We've made some projections on what the size of the labor force will look like into the future and compared it to what it has looked like in the past. And just by point of comparison, if we look at the high point of this graph in the 1990s, Minnesota was adding about 54,000 additional workers each year during that decade. That means about 540,000 additional people in the workforce over the course of the whole decade. Those numbers have been dropping off as the aging trend has continued and as the low birth rates that followed the baby boom generation moved into the working age years. And so now we only predict to add about 7,000 additional people each year for the foreseeable future for the next 15 to 20 years. In the past, that meant that when employers would send out, post a job, they would get all kinds of resumes with all kinds of skills to choose from. The labor force was growing so quickly, they really didn't even understand that it was the backdrop to kind of the employment picture. But today, they really are beginning to see the difference in that you can put out a job posting and have very few people apply. What these numbers mean going forward is that the number of people that we have in Minnesota in the workforce today is going to be very similar to the number of people that we have in the workforce in 10 years and in 15 years. And so, that has the potential to cap economic growth if employers are not able to have their needs met with the workforce that we have. I should say when I share these numbers with employers, they get big eyes. They, say, what are we going to do? This is a difficult situation, and now you're telling us that it may last into the future. When I share these numbers with young people, they think, well, this looks okay. I think I could do something about these numbers. So it certainly means more opportunities around if we are able to train folks to fill the needs that employers have. But it is a very different situation than what we've experienced in past decades. I began by sharing the numbers with you about where we are growing, and the growth of the labor force kind of follows those patterns. We've done projections county by county about how the labor force is expected to change in size. And when we look across the state, because most of the growth is concentrated in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, that's where we project the majority of the growth in the labor force. Many other areas of the state have already begun to experience a decline in the size of the labor force and are projected to continue as the baby boomers move into retirement. An area that is declining in size in terms of the labor force is usually doing so because you have that movement out of the baby boomers and you don't have as large of a younger generation moving in to fill those spots that the baby boomers are vacating. Sometimes people will say, well, what about older adults working longer? Isn't that going to help? I know that I am, I know that I'm 75 years old and I don't plan to retire anytime soon. And indeed, that is the case that we have seen people stay in the workforce longer. It hasn't been as massive of a transition that many people would expect. You can see here in this graph I'm showing you in the blue line is 1990 and 2015 is the red line. So you can see that, around the ages of 60, around the ages of 65, we have maybe 10% more in the labor force. But those numbers drop off very quickly after about the age of 60 or so. And so we've built these differences over time into our labor force projections. We've already accounted for the fact that older adults are likely to work longer. So we can't go back in time and have more children to fix this problem. To fix this situation, I don't know so much as a problem as a shift, but that's really what is producing these patterns, are changes 65 plus years ago in our birth patterns, and the fact that our birth patterns, our birth rates have been very low in recent years is something that we will continue to feel in terms of labor force for the coming decades.
Dr. Brower, how do you think this weather in the last few days has been helping us advertise the jobs that we have around this state? I have children, I just can't get them to move back to Minnesota when they have 25, 30 below zero temperature. I thought I raised hardy kids, but no.
Mr. Chair, the weather, I think, is indeed a factor. If you look at the map of the U.S. and where people are moving, it's hard to get people to move in mass numbers to that frost belt that I was talking about earlier. The hopeful thing is that many of our children who move away eventually do return. And in fact, this graph here shows you that we have actually had, for the second year in a row, net domestic migration, which means more people moving from other states to Minnesota than moving out of Minnesota. And that had been a pattern of, we had lost people for 15 years straight. You can see the green bars in the negative here between 2002 and 2016, I'm sorry. We had lost young people, typically are who are the people who move. We had lost folks to other states for that long period of time. And now with the last two data points, 2017 and 2018, we've actually seen a net gain of people.
Doctor, do you have any data on why they're moving back these last couple of years? I don't know if you cover that or not, but.
Mr. Chair, we've looked at that, and there is not a clear indication of why that is, but there are factors that would help explain it. There are some clues, but I wouldn't say that there's a definitive answer on why that is. The clues are that, we've had this very strong economy for the last several years, very low unemployment, that job opportunities, the word has gotten out about the job opportunities here in Minnesota, and that has, eventually taken hold with respect to our migration patterns. If we look at other metropolitan areas that are nearby, they have been, particularly in the Midwest, I'm thinking of Chicago and Detroit in particular, those states, those metropolitan areas have been losing hundreds of thousands of people in the last 8 to 10 years. And so I would expect that our relatively strong economy and position is picking up some of that, some of those losses.
Thank you. Dr. Brower, I think we have a couple of questions here. I don't know who was first, but I'll go with.
Mr. Chair, Dr. Brower, my question is, do we have any expectation whether that trend on domestic migration will continue over the next few years? Do you have any projections about where we're sitting on our domestic migration trends?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I am watching these numbers just as I show them to you today. I hesitate to project anything out that I don't have enough historical data to kind of back up, and we've had a very long run of losses. And so I am optimistic that this will continue, but I don't, I can't say definitively that it will be. And so we have built very little domestic migration into our population projections going forward. If we continue to see a rise in domestic migration into the future, then we will adjust those projections upward to accommodate that. But at this point, we're still watching it to see if it's something that is really a trend or if it's a blip.
Thank you.
Representative Hassan. Representative.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I would like to know how immigration plays into this. I know that the Somali community has been moving here in bigger numbers, and I know also other immigrant communities are also doing the same. Have you guys looked at immigration and how that's playing a role?
Mr. Chair, Representative, the blue lines on this graph, I'm glad you brought that up. the blue lines on this graph are showing you the gains from international immigration. And you can see that that has contributed to the growth that we project. We gain somewhere between, in the past few years, we've gained somewhere between 10 and 15,000 additional people coming from abroad to Minnesota each year. But you can see in the most recent period in 2018 that that number has dropped off a bit. So that even though we have had these increases in domestic migration, we have seen a drop off in international immigration in the last year. And so that's going to play into these numbers as well. In terms of the historic pattern of growth, contribution of immigration to our growth, it dropped off over the course of the recession and picked up again afterwards. And then in the most recent period, we've seen that number drop off again.
Representative Hassan.
Mr. Chair, I have a follow-up question. So what I'm talking about is not immigration from internationally immigrating here. So there are a lot of immigrants who will, arrive at Georgia or Florida or New York, but then they just pick up, as soon as they get their documents, they pack whatever they have and just come here. So it would be domestic migration. It wouldn't be international.
Dr. Brower.
Mr. Chair, Representative, that's right. As far as this classification is showing, those folks who are what we call secondary immigrants would be included in those green bars in the domestic, just as you said. That's right. Yep.
Representative Haley, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the net migration, do you have any statistics or research on when sort of kids come back home? Traditionally, you want to leave home, you want to get away when you graduate, and then is the theory right that when people want to settle down, then they're moved back to their home state, potentially to be by family? Any projection on how that plays out in Minnesota?
Mr. Chair, Representative, we can look at the age pattern of how migration works. And typically what we do see are young people moving away. I should back up and say, we see all kinds of movement in and out of the state. What we're looking at here is just net numbers. So in any given year, we have more than 100,000 people moving in or out. And this is just showing us what the balance is. In terms of the pattern of movement over the life course, 18, 19, 20 is when we see those initial moves, and that's when we lose most of our people in the state, is because of the moves of young people around that time. We do see a move backward, a return migration move in the 30s, which would tell us that's consistent with having children, wanting to move back home to parents, to home communities. We also see that in terms of movement within the state, that you see movement into sometimes metropolitan areas and back to more rural communities around that time. So that's consistent with those moves. I should say, just kind of reiterate that there's a lot of movement going on all the time for all these different reasons. I can say kind of that the drivers of that movement tend to be young people who are in their late teens and early 20s.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a follow-up question? I represent Goodhue and Wabasha County, and previously was told that we were the fastest aging county in the state. And then there was a study done by, I don't recall his name, a demographer out of the University of Minnesota, who countered that and said, actually, we are seeing, to your point, the young people coming back. Do you have any thoughts on that, or maybe you know the study I'm referencing?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that sounds to me like Ben Winchester's work. Areas age quickly because they have a large population of older adults. I didn't have to go to demography school to tell you that. But the other piece of it is just how big is that younger generation relative to the generation of older adults. So if you have a county that is aging very rapidly, it's a combination of the size of that that older group, but also the migration patterns of the younger folks. And what Mr. Winchester showed is that there tends to be this reverse pattern out around the age of 32 home communities. And that is true. It's a big trend, but it doesn't typically fully counter the number of people who moved initially. So for many rural areas, we saw at the beginning the map, the gray areas were showing us where there had been population losses, typically along the western edge and the southern edge of the state. Those are areas where the pattern tends to be that the young generation is moving out. Many move in, as Mr. Winchester noted, but typically on balance, there's still a net loss for those areas.
Can I ask one final question?
Go right ahead.
Thank you. This was back to the slide on, we can't make up this gap in our workforce. I'm trying to find how the number of people you said that our deficit is, and I wondered if you had a corresponding number for the number of open jobs we have in the state at any one time, because that really puts it in perspective that this is a chasm we're talking about. Do you know? Or maybe the chair knows?
Mr. Chair, Representative, so I would just say that the numbers that we have projected here are the number of people available to work, and we apply the percentage of people who are likely to be labor force participants to get to these numbers. This says nothing about their skills. It says nothing about where they're located in the state relative to the jobs. And so to get to that point, and the point that you're raising, Representative, we tend to look at numbers out of the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development on job vacancies. So these are a little bit different numbers than kind of what we project, because we're just projecting the availability of people in general. And here, the numbers that we're seeing, the comparison that we're seeing is the availability of people who are unemployed, meaning that they are actively looking for work, compared to the number of job openings that we have. And what we have in the most recent period, the second quarter of 2018, shows that there are about 140,000 job openings in Minnesota and about 80,000 people actively looking for work, which is a very different picture, as you can see, during the course of the recession, where that gap opened up, where we had a surplus of people who were looking for jobs compared to the number of available jobs. That gap has closed, and now we have this surplus of jobs over people. I will say these are statewide numbers. These numbers are available at the regional level as well. And when I have looked region by region, the picture is very similar. This gap opening up over the course of the recession, where you have this surplus of people looking for work, and it's either narrowed or surpassed now, the number of jobs relative to the number of people.
What would be interesting is if we could figure out the types of jobs that 60,000 kind of gap that we have, and help. In Germany, they actually start job counseling for kids in 7th and 8th grade, what we would call 7th and 8th grade. I'm not sure I really want to propose a bill that has high schools and junior highs telling parents, well, your son or your daughter should really look in this particular area versus this particular area, especially since how my home address is public. But it has really, really worked well in Germany, and and parents accept it and work with the counselors, and kids have a much clearer idea of where middle class paying jobs are, and they make a choice, certainly much earlier in life than I did. We won't go down that route. So Representative Sundin, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some comments and some concerns here. Representative Hassan spoke about the cultural magnetism that goes on when one group of, one ethnic group migrates towards a population base that's existing. And that's how we've seen that happen in the metro area. That's bolstered the number of people in the metro area, not unlike what happened 100 years ago with the Swedes and the Finns, and the couple Norwegians.
Some Germans too.
One German, populating the rest of the state. You know, there's opportunity there, so that's where they went. We understand that, but with the heavy migration of, or concentration of people in the metro area, the seven-county area, I'm just wondering what are the other driving forces? And I'd like to see at some point, let's say a side-by-side or one of your fancy graphs in color that, not in black and white, but in color, so I can understand the economic driving forces, such as wages in those greater Minnesota counties versus the metro counties, and then unemployment rates there as well. So what are the job opportunities there? I'd like to see something like that at some point. But and then another question about the older workers hanging on to their jobs and working longer. I'm just curious as to why they're doing that. Do they have inadequate pensions and they have to, or they just need something to do? That was a question.
Mr. Chair,
Dr. Brown.
Representative, the research suggests that the baby boom generation is more oriented toward work and stays in the workforce a little bit longer, but not as long as kind of the extension in life expectancy would allow. So they're still retiring probably before they have to on average, because there's a group that wants to, and then there's also a group that has to because the work that they do they just can't continue to do in the older years. I tend to think about work like mine where I'm sitting in a chair, but when we look across all the industries, you see retirement rates, you see a younger population in the construction industry, for example, because it's just tough work as bodies age.
Representative Gunter, you had a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. You know, I live in the bacon capital of the nation, and there is a complete lack of swine herders, as I call them. The salary's already gone up to $39,000 a year. They can't get anybody to do it. It is a little odoriferous, but it is becoming a big problem, and I anticipate bacon going up in price substantially if it continues. And I look at in agriculture, in the dairy industry, and everything else, it's really getting to be critical. And we have to do something to enhance the people that are going into that industry are, in our area, basically Latinos and a few Somalis, but they are getting a very good salary. Minimum wage means nothing down there anymore. They bid for other people, workers, by increasing the salary. So I think it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing both. Mm-hmm. We have one school district that has looked for 3 years to get a fifth grade teacher. They finally raised the salary up to what they pay in the suburbs, and they're getting people to go to work there. So the results of having this ratio of jobs to job seekers is showing some positive benefits, in my opinion. And it's going to be, the cost of living where I live is about 30%. Is that about right? Way down in the Iowa line?
I'd have to look.
But it's about 30% less than it is up here. And basically it's housing. But things are changing, and I think in a positive way. I look at the president's idea of allowing DACA people to become citizens, and creating a pathway to citizenships for a lot of people that have to be vetted. But I mean, I'm looking forward to those things. because we desperately need workers throughout Minnesota. We could start 200 jobs in a food processing plant in Fairmont tomorrow if we could find the workers. Now, there's a reason why we're shrinking 16,000 people since 1960. And it's getting to be more apparent that it's availability of workers. Senior citizens, our hospital, 60% of the people who go to our hospital, Mayo Hospital, Fairmont, is our Medicare or Medicaid people. The hospital has to charge me 17% more because of not making any money in those populations. So it's really, things are changing so fast, people can hardly keep up with them. And senior citizens are moving down there because they can live like they live in Minnetonka compared to what it costs up here.
If you're looking for a comment, I will tell you that I have been in Fairmont a number of times. I've been around the state touring, and you can use your campaign funds to cover the cost, by the way, to tour other facilities on manufacturing and job opportunities. But having enjoyed Representative Gunter's company at some places where they serve Martin County bacon, will be well worth the price increase.
And all your legislators will be invited to try that in May. The I-90 part. Look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you, Representative Gunter. Representative Hassan, and then we're going to move on, let the doctor finish. Go ahead.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I think, I don't know if those small towns are ready for the racial and the diversity that comes with having new people. There are a lot of people in the metro who are afraid to go out to those small towns, but are looking for a job. So maybe we should talk after this. Thank you.
Can I answer that?
Representative Gunter.
I had 2 towns in my district that are over 50% minority population. And in Wilmer and Worthington, the only place they speak more languages is St. Paul than Worthington. So there's a lot of diversity, and it's growing all the time. And we are welcoming it. Our school district now has 17% minority population from 2 not too many years ago.
Well, Representative Gunter, Representative Hassan, my grandparents damn near had heart attacks when my Irish father started dating their German daughter. So there's hope for America. It may take longer than we care for, but there is hope for it. Representative Moran, this last final question, then, as I said, we're going to move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's not a question, but it's kind of like a response to your conversation around workforce and going into like junior high schools. And I know by sitting on the education committee back in 2013-14 under the leadership of Representative Mariani and Marquardt, we started this creating the world best workforce. And part of that initiative was looking back and getting the trades into elementary schools and get them into high school and creating those partnerships, but also making that part of the teachers' conversations and beginning to ask the students sometime when, they're so young and they don't see that far back into the future about what would you like to be when you grow up. And then if they cannot respond to that, then begin to create some suggestions based on what they like, what they have seen in their environment, but creating those conversations for young people to really begin to envision themselves in the workplace and creating a future for them. So I just mentioned all that because I am really a supporter of, how we begin to look at how we legislate to more of not just, one committee, but how that relates into other committees and to do the work that we need to do for, the people around the state of Minnesota. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Moran. Doctor, would you care to continue? If you can remember where you left
Mr.
off.
Chair, I'd be happy to. So the numbers coming out of DEED with the job vacancy survey do indeed look at industry. They look at occupations as well. And they also look to specific regions of the state. So we do have more information about where some of those job openings are. The numbers I'm showing you here are for statewide. The bars indicate the number of job vacancies, and the dots are showing you what the median wage in that industry is. And so you can see that there is a tremendous demand for work in healthcare and social assistance, in retail, in food. But of course, these jobs, many of these jobs, not all, tend to have lower median wages. And so some of the work that's been done recently by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis has showed that as the state, as the region has come out of the recession, part of what's happened is people have moved up the jobs ladder, the skills ladder, the wage ladder, and that has left kind of this glut of jobs at the lower end of the skill spectrum and wage spectrum. So while there is a tremendous demand for workers, and there's a demand across the board, it's not only just in these industries, but it's especially concentrated in these industries. We need to keep in mind that it doesn't necessarily mean more opportunities for more folks, given that many of these jobs are lower wage jobs. Slower workforce could translate to slower economic growth if employers aren't able to find the workers that they need. And I think we're beginning to hear stories in the last couple of years where it is becoming a limit for many people that employers cannot grow to the extent that they would like to be able to because they can't find the workers they need. As Representative Gunter said, perhaps it might be a wage issue. Is the compensation enough? And maybe that's something that can be resolved by increasing wages. It just depends on whether that's possible in the particular industry, if the profit margins are there, if the reimbursement rates are there, if it's something that's in the medical field where you get reimbursed at a certain rate. But what I will say into the future is that we do not expect to have a whole lot more population growth fueling this. Again, it's based on what we've seen in the most recent years. We could see a turnaround, but if what the patterns that we've experienced continue, we will likely not see much more growth in the labor force at the same time that the economy is expanding. And so,
Dr. Bauer, we have a question. Representative Eklund?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Bauer, on your previous slide when you talked about the median wage and job vacancy by industry, at a future time, could you provide us a similar slide that would show what that means with the benefit package also for those industries?
Mr. Chair.
Doctor?
Representative, I am not sure if those numbers are collected by this survey, but I will look into it, and if they are, I certainly will provide it, yes.
Please
Mr. Chair.
proceed.
So the demographics we can't do a whole lot about. They're going to continue to play out. As I said, we can't go back in time and make more workers. Immigration is a short-term fix. It's probably the quickest thing, and it tends to go hand in hand with labor force growth. When you have both international and domestic immigration, that's how you create more workers quickly. There are other policies and things that we can think about doing that improve the situation, though, and that improves the efficiency and the productivity of each worker and improves the match between employers' needs and workers' skills. And so those kinds of policy interventions are likely to be those that are most effective. Sometimes I get questions about policies that would increase the birth rate. I can say that Other Nordic countries, other Asian countries have been down this road ahead of us. They've seen the labor force growth rate drop off because of their birth patterns. They've tried it, hasn't worked. Hasn't worked very well. It's hard to convince, 20-year-old, we're thinking about the parent generation, just what they should do with their own family size. And so while it's been tried, that typically hasn't been a useful solution. So better alignment of workers' skills and the jobs available, the employer's needs, both geographic match we were talking about earlier, and the skills match. And then I think we need to think about increasing the productivity of each worker. One way that you do that is by, increasing efficiency. But if you have people who are higher skilled, higher level of education, they tend to produce goods and services that are of greater value, which increases economic output or grows the economy. Even if we don't have more people to do it, we have people who are producing goods of greater value. And so education and skills plays in here. When we have very little growth, slow growth projected, it's important that we have every possible worker skilled up and ready to go at their highest potential. And I think that's where we really have room to grow in the coming years. In terms of economic development, I think it's important to think about how to be selective, and I know you all do this now, but to continue to be selective about the economic development opportunities that we support. Because with few people available and projected to be few people in the future relative to the number of jobs, we just have the opportunity to be choosy about the kinds of jobs that are going to support economic stability for families.
And I hope members keep that in mind when DEED comes back with their economic development group to present when they come back, next week, to present about their economic development. Because it is how we survive, is we higher value products with less people.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chair. I haven't talked, and I won't talk a great deal about automation, but it certainly plays in here because now would be the time that employers would choose to make investments in automation that would substitute work that people can do for work that machines can do. I realize this is tough to read, and I apologize, but I just wanted to point to some research that McKinsey has done that looks at industry by industry. What are the capabilities of the automation that we have today that could immediately be used to supplement the workforce that we have, and in what industries are those likely to have the greatest impact? Industries that have work that is repetitive, physical, predictable work are industries where we now have the automation to be able to move into these industries and replace some of the work that people are doing. And you can see that topping the list of kind of where we have that capability is among accommodation and food service, among manufacturing. There are many jobs across the board where we still just don't have the the technology to be able to replace people. That may come in the coming years, but we're experiencing these shortages today, and we're likely to continue to experience them over the coming years. And the automation just isn't there for many industries, many job types, to be able to supplement immediately. I would say replace immediately. We probably can supplement immediately, but not replace immediately. We briefly mentioned how trends in racial and ethnic diversity are bolstering our growth in the state. That has to do in part with international immigration. It has to do in part with populations of color that have been in Minnesota for some time. We've seen the growth of populations of color increase over the last 20 to 25 years in particular. And that increase has been driving our growth in population, growth in workforce, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. When we look at our younger generations, we are much more racially, ethnically, culturally diverse than our older generations, and so we can expect that moving into the working years will be a much more diverse group than is leaving the working years. To the extent that our gaps in academic achievement, in employment, fall along racial lines, this will become increasingly important for our overall productivity as we move forward. So I hate to be the bearer of, I find myself oftentimes being the bearer of bad news. Sorry about that. But the picture that we have does open up more opportunities for more people. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing, but we are looking at very slow labor force growth for the coming decades. And that means that immigration becomes really important, both domestic and international immigration. It means that longer term, we need to look at continue raising the skill profile of our workers, the workers that we do have, and then pay attention to those achievement gaps as it becomes very critical to make sure that everyone is working to their full potential. And those are the comments that I've prepared for today. I'm happy to take more questions if there's time.
Thank you, Dr. Brower. As always, the presentation by the state demographers is informative, and it raises a lot of questions and concerns that we should be addressing and try to addressing. I'm going to open it up to questions, and Representative Kosnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Brower, thanks for the presentation. I'd seen other statistics and stuff, and I was wondering if you could comment and maybe provide to the committee, if you have some, on the use of state resources. There's a lot of discussion sometimes with immigrant communities. Sometimes there's a concern on how much, when we have immigrants, what the additional cost to the state is. But then I've seen research that shows second-generation immigrants actually become more productive, economically successful than the current population in the second generation of the immigrancy. Can you comment on that, if that makes sense? I don't know that I'm using the right demographic terms, but, and then just comment on that, and if you do have some data that you could forward to the committee on that, I'd be interested in having that.
That was tactfully said.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I have seen a couple of reports that try to get their research arms around kind of contributions versus costs of immigrants to the state, and I would be happy to pass those on. In my read of those reports, it's a hard thing to measure. So there are wide and varying estimates, but certainly we do see for many generations, second and third generations, that the economic stability and integration into workforce and so forth of those groups really does pick up after the second and third generations. We have a report, I think, that may speak to that issue that we've recently released called The Economic Status of Minnesotans, and that's on our website. And it's where we look specifically at Minnesota's 17 largest cultural groups. So not the broad race groups, but the large groups that are important to Minnesota, such as Hmong, Somali, Latino. We look specifically at Mexican because we're trying to look at kind of national origin. And we look at a number of different indicators of labor force participation, of kind of economic resources and kind of social capital available to those groups, to the extent that we're able to do so with the data that we have. But that'll be another resource that I can send along.
Thank you, that'd be great. I'd be interested in seeing that.
I can tell you from my own district, I've been here 20 years. Huge landing platform in my district for the Hmong community. And the parents still live there, but all the kids are out in, Oakdale and Woodbury and Afton and Marina St. Croix, and then they drive in on the weekend and hang out with mom and dad. And it's pretty interesting to see. And the same with the Latino. I have probably I think the 6th or 7th largest Latino district in the state. And from 10 years ago, seeing where they rented to today, where they now own, they haven't moved out to the suburbs. They've moved to the eastern edge of the district, which is, for some people would call it a stronger housing stock. So it's fun to watch as your ethnic groups progress through those stages. I have a picture of my grandmother, my grandmother in the mud hut, the sod house out on the prairie. And, when we closed down our house about 15, 20 years ago, it was no sod house, let me tell you. So, yeah, it's fun to watch that. And that's, anecdotally, 100% support on that.
No, well, thank you. I think in the context, Mr. Chair, of, economic development and the jobs, which is the purview of this committee, needing to fill those job opportunities and job losses or fill those important jobs, that new immigrants and new Americans provide a solution for that, but then also down the road it provides for our economic stability for our country. So if the other statistics that I've seen match with yours, I'd be pleased to see that.
Representative Noor, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Browse, I just have a question about the achievement gap as we see it. I know that there's also the opportunity gaps that exist, the high unemployment in immigrant community, particularly Somalis who are seeking employment. Number one is the skills gap. Number two, it's the language issue that many employers are not incorporating into their systems because they haven't developed ways to bring other languages into the system. Could you speak to that for a minute, please?
Dr. Bauer.
Mr. Chair, Representative, one of the things that we tried to address with this report, economic status of Minnesotans, were kind of the broad range of barriers to employment or for employers to finding workers. And language was among those. Educational attainment was among those. So I would say, across many different diverse communities that we have, the barriers are almost as diverse as the communities are. The good news is that employers are starting to, in my experience in being out in the community and talking to employers, they're starting now after a couple years of low unemployment to realize that they need to act differently than they have in the past, that they need to understand what those barriers are and take responsibility for removing some of those barriers. I would say 5 years ago, that wasn't necessarily, some did, but for the most part, they didn't see it as kind of their job one to be thinking about that kind of stuff. You mentioned one other piece I've forgotten now. If I remember, I'll come back to it. I'm sorry.
A follow-up?
Well, Mr. Chair, Dr. Browse, I'll give you a quick example.
Yeah.
When Amazon opened their big area in Shakopee, they could not find any employees. I worked with them. They recruited thousands of employees from, working in their fulfillment center and their logistics. And somehow the investment in those communities by these big companies, by providing them the skills to move into different jobs and different pathways, does not exist. So I'm trying to bring in a way of saying employers can have they can recruit employees from different communities. In fact, they came to the office that I was working in, they did the assessment, they did the testing, the buses, they provided transportation, which was a barrier coming from South Minneapolis, all the way to Shakopee. So bringing that whole package has really worked, but there hasn't been any consistent process by the employers to look into how to tap into that type of workforce. It's something that I think not only for the state, but the institutions and employers and agencies need to be looking into. Thank you, Dr. Morris.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Stevenson.
I have a quick question that relates to just one individual job, which is reapportionment is right around the corner. And I'm curious, are you feeling, I know we're right on the line. Are you feeling bullish or bearish on us keeping our 8th congressional seat?
Mr. Chair, Representative, going back to this graph here, we've had a couple years in the last 2 years of really strong growth in Minnesota. It's outpaced the growth that we have seen earlier in this decade. And so if you had asked me that same question in 2011, well, I did get asked that same question in 2011, I was much more hesitant about our ability to retain 8 congressional districts than I am today. Looking at the growth that we've seen in the last couple years, it's absolutely within our ability to do so. I mean, there's several years, there's a couple more years to go here until the census, and it doesn't depend only on how we grow, it depends on how all other states grow in comparison to us. But the numbers, we're still very, very much on the cusp of losing that seat, but it's looking much more possible than it was 6 years ago. So another piece of my, I wouldn't just say a piece, a majority of my job in addition to doing these demographic numbers right now is to promote and organize around the 2020 census, and it is going to be so important for all of us to make sure that our count is complete across the board, because there's a lot at stake in addition to political representation, our federal funding as well.
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions. Thank you, Dr. Brower. Appreciate a very informative presentation. And
thanks for having me.
And I'm sure your phone number is available, and you are more than happy to answer questions like all of our state.
Those things are true. Thank you.
Are there any other comments to be made today? Have we eaten all the absolute high bar treats? Well, that was kind of a hint that you can take some home with, to the office with you and be good to your staff. With that, we are adjourned for today.